A 19-year-old girl named Layla had been living on her own for months after leaving the orphanage. She had spent many sleepless nights, shivering on the cold ground. Tonight, hunger made her feel weak. It had been 2 whole days since she last ate anything. Desperate, Layla walked down the back alley behind a fancy restaurant called Sterling. The smell of delicious food from the kitchen made her stomach growl, and the bright kitchen lights shone out into the alley, making the wet cobblestone sparkle. Layla stood still for a moment, listening to the sounds from the kitchen. Clanging pots, chefs shouting orders, and the busy noise of a place filled with food and life. Her heart raced as she glanced around to make sure no one could see her. Then, she slipped quietly into the warmth of the kitchen, which felt like a comforting hug. For a moment, Layla stood still, amazed by all the food around her. She could almost taste the warmth of it. But just as she was about to reach for a basket of fresh rolls, a woman in a red dress caught her attention. It was Samira Malik, a wealthy woman known for her beauty and power. Layla's heart stopped for a second as she remembered the cruel words Samira had said to her the night before when Layla had accidentally bumped into her. Samira had mocked her without mercy. Now, Samira wasn't just sitting as a guest in the restaurant. She looked even more dangerous. With a calm, controlled movement, Samira took a small bottle from her purse. Inside it was a strange, glowing liquid. Samira carefully poured some drops of it onto a plate of food sitting on the counter. Layla watched as Samira's face remained calm, even as she did something horrible. After a quick glance around, Samira smiled coldly and walked out of the kitchen, her high heels clicking loudly on the floor. Layla felt her heart racing. What she had just seen was terrifying. The liquid Samira poured into the food smelled bitter and sharp, and Layla instantly recognized it. It was cyanide, a poison she knew well from her time working in a factory. A chill ran down her spine. She knew the food wasn't for just anyone. It was meant for someone, and that someone was in danger. Layla didn't hesitate. She ran to the plate of food, almost without thinking. The scent of poison was still in the air, making her stomach turn. She knew she had to act fast. A waiter was already leaving the kitchen with the food, carrying it to a fancy table in the restaurant. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she ran outside, praying she wouldn't be too late. She had to stop the waiter. Someone's life was in danger. Outside, the bright lights of the restaurant made it look so far away from Layla's cold, lonely world. She ran to the entrance, gasping for breath, almost there when a large security guard blocked her path. He was tall and strong, and for a second, Layla felt small and helpless in her dirty clothes. But she couldn't stop. She pleaded with him, her voice trembling. "Please, sir, I need to get inside. Someone's life is in danger." The guard didn't listen. He grabbed her arm, holding it firmly so she couldn't move. Layla tried to pull away, but it was no use. Tears filled her eyes as she cried out, "There's a woman inside. She poisoned the food. Please, you have to stop it." She saw a glimpse of the waiter walking through the restaurant, holding the poisoned food. Her heart sank as she realized she was too late. The fancy people inside didn't notice anything wrong. Layla's voice cracked as she shouted louder, "Please, he's going to die if he eats that food." Her words echoed through the lobby, and the people inside stopped talking. They turned to stare at her in confusion. More staff came running to see what was happening. The guard didn't care. He dragged Layla back, his grip hurting her arm. Then Layla saw Samira Malik walking through the door. Samira looked at her, and for a brief moment, her eyes seemed to warn Layla. But Samira just smiled, as if nothing was wrong. "You won't get away with this," Layla whispered, shaking with anger. Samira's cold, elegant face was a reminder that some people would always use their power to hurt others. But Layla wasn't going to give up. She had tried to warn them. She couldn't just let someone die. Layla yelled, trying to get someone's attention as she was pulled away, but her voice was swallowed up by the loud noise of the restaurant. No one could hear her, and the waiter, completely unaware of what was happening, carried a dangerous dish into the dining room. Layla's heart sank in her chest, and she felt like she was falling into darkness. Her knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold, hard sidewalk. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was powerless, stuck in a world that wouldn't listen. Her eyes were blurred with tears, and all she could do was watch helplessly as Nura, the woman behind this whole mess, stepped into her sleek car. Nura's lips curved into a confident, self-satisfied smirk as she sped away. Layla shivered. She was alone with the terrible knowledge that an innocent life could be lost, and no one would believe her. Inside the restaurant, the sudden crash of breaking glass made her look up. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt like everything was happening in slow motion. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. "Please, let something stop this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the universe might hear her silent plea. Layla turned toward the entrance, watching as the security guard who had shoved her aside just moments before was distracted, his attention focused on his phone. This was her chance. The guard was looking away. The door opened as a group of well-dressed patrons approached, their laughter filling the air. Layla's pulse quickened. It was now or never. With quick, nimble steps, she slipped in behind the group, making sure to stay quiet as her bare feet made no sound on the polished marble floor. Her heart was pounding, and she had to remind herself to keep calm. She ducked behind a large arrangement of white orchids in the lobby, using the flowers as cover. Her breath was coming fast, and she could feel her heart thumping in her chest, so hard it seemed like it might burst. She couldn't stay here for long. Her eyes scanned the dining room, desperate to find Salim. And then she saw him. Salim al-Badawi was sitting at the center of the grand dining room, holding a silver fork, poised to eat. A mist of steam rose from the dish before him, a tempting, poisonous cloud. Layla's chest tightened. Her breath stopped. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stop him. "Don't let him eat it," she thought, her body tensing in panic. Without thinking, she rushed forward. Her foot knocked a tray of champagne glasses from a nearby table, sending them crashing to the floor. Chairs toppled in her wake. "Don't eat that," she shouted, her voice breaking as she tried to warn him. "Your wife put poison in it." The room fell into stunned silence as the fork slipped from Salim's hand and clattered loudly onto the porcelain plate. The sound echoed, like a death knell in the thick air of the restaurant. People stared, horrified, as Salim's body jerked violently. His limbs convulsed uncontrollably, and plates crashed to the floor, adding to the chaos. Screams filled the room, some patrons running, others frozen in terror. Layla's voice cracked as she shouted again. It was Nura. "I saw her put poison in his food." Panic rippled through the room, but no one acted. Salim's body continued to spasm, his face turning a sickly purple. He was struggling to breathe, his body fighting against the poison. Layla's heart pounded in her ears, but she knew what had to be done. She couldn't just stand there. A young waiter rushed forward with a glass of water, but Layla knocked it out of his hand. "He could choke on that," she said urgently, her voice sharp. "We need to turn him on his side so he can breathe." The room was filled with panic, confusion, and disbelief. Layla, though small and young, commanded attention as she took charge of the situation. "Clear the space around him. He needs room to breathe," she shouted, her voice growing stronger. The crowd started to shift, moving back to give her space. An elderly woman spoke out, her voice trembling but firm. "Let her help. Can't you see she's trying to save him?" The guard hesitated, unsure, but Layla didn't have time to wait. She worked quickly, loosening Salim's tie and collar, easing the pressure around his neck. Her hands were rough, and her clothes were far from clean, but she worked with the confidence of someone who had seen enough suffering to know exactly what needed to be done. Salim's spasms gradually slowed. His breathing was shallow and ragged, but it was there. Layla's heart raced, and her hands shook from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. "Please, call an ambulance," she called out one last time, her voice carrying the weight of her desperation. For a long moment, no one moved. The room was still. The disbelief in the air was thick. But slowly, people began to understand. They began to see that Layla was trying to save Salim's life. Layla was a girl from the streets, covered in dirt and sweat, surrounded by people in fancy clothes. Her voice had been ignored, but now, in the middle of the chaos, it was the only thing that made sense. Salim's body stopped convulsing, but he was still weak, barely holding on to consciousness. Layla didn't stop. She knew there wasn't much time left. "I need to get him to the hospital," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion, but also with determination. She wasn't going to let him die, not after everything she had done to get this far. Layla wedged herself under Salim's arm, helping him to his feet. His body was heavy, and he leaned against her for support. Every step felt like a battle. Salim was disoriented, his voice a mere whisper. "Who are you?" he asked, his words barely audible. "I'm the one trying to save your life," Layla replied, her voice firm. "My name's Layla. We need to go. Can you walk?" The manager of the restaurant stepped forward, eyes full of suspicion. "Don't trust her, Mr. al-Badawi," he said, his voice sharp. "She must be involved in this." But Salim, though weak, leaned on Layla, accepting her support. "Trust me, Mr. al-Badawi," Layla whispered. "I'm the only one here who wants to help." Together, they made their way toward the exit. The security guard stood in their path, glaring at them. Layla's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "He needs a doctor, not accusations," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. The cold night air hit them as they stepped outside, and the world felt wide and strange. The hospital was a few blocks away, but Layla wasn't sure they would make it in time. Salim's face was pale, his breathing shallow. But she kept going, her muscles aching, her legs burning. She looked at Salim, trying to stay calm. "I see the hospital lights," she said, her voice strained. "Just a little more, Salim. You're going to be okay." But deep down, Layla knew that time was running out. She could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder. If they didn't get to the hospital in time, Salim might not make it. She quickened her pace, pushing her tired body as hard as it would go. Every step felt like it could be her last. But Layla wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Not now. Salim let out a deep, painful sound that made Layla shiver with fear. His eyes were unfocused, but he was still staring at her, silently begging her to not speak. Layla's voice trembled as she whispered, "Save your strength, Mr. al-Badawi." Ahead of them, a group of loud and drunken people staggered by, laughing and unaware of the danger surrounding them. Layla knew they couldn't walk through the crowd. They would be noticed and caught. She steered them into a narrow, dark alley instead, hoping they wouldn't be seen. The air was thick with the smell of trash and standing water. Layla's bare feet splashed through the grimy puddles. The ground was slick and uneven, and Salim nearly collapsed when he stepped on a shard of glass. His weight pulled on Layla, but she held on tightly, determined not to let him fall. "Stay with me," she said, trying to keep him from stumbling. "I won't let you fall behind." The loud wail of sirens grew closer, reminding Layla that time was running out. The city lights shone bright, reflecting off the towering skyscrapers that stretched up into the dark sky. Layla's worn-out clothes flapped against her legs as they walked, but she didn't care about how she looked. She only cared about getting Salim to safety. His body, once strong and proud, was now shaking with weakness, leaning heavily against her. His clothes, once crisp and clean, were damp with sweat and dirt. "We can't let them catch us before we reach the hospital," Layla whispered, glancing nervously at the busy market stalls around them. The vendors were shouting out their wares, and the sharp smell of spices filled the air. It all felt so unreal in the face of their danger. Salim's breathing was slow and shallow. His eyes flickered, barely open, and Layla could see that he wasn't fully aware of what was happening around him. She guided him carefully to a small convenience store where they paused for a moment. The shopkeeper, an older man with a neatly trimmed beard, glanced up from his newspaper. He looked at Layla and then at Salim, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. A young street girl, helping a rich man who looked very sick. The man's face darkened, and Layla could feel the tension rising. "Please, sir," Layla begged. "He's very sick. Just let us rest here for a minute." The storekeeper's fingers twitched toward his phone, his face hardening. "Leave now." "I won't have any trouble in my store," he barked, dismissing them with a cold stare. Layla's heart sank. She tightened her grip on Salim, who groaned again, a sound full of pain. They stepped back out into the crowded streets, the flow of people threatening to pull them in different directions. The noise of the city felt deafening, and each jostle of the crowd sent a new wave of pain through Salim's body. Layla's arms burned with the strain of keeping them both upright. A woman in a brightly colored scarf stopped when she saw Salim's pale face. Her eyes widened with concern, and she began to ask what had happened. But Layla cut her off, her voice sharp with panic. "No time. He needs the hospital now." She pulled Salim forward, ignoring the woman's worried questions. Just then, a police patrol car drove by, its headlights shining on Salim's sweaty face. Layla's breath caught in her throat, and she pressed them both closer to the side of the street, behind a newspaper stand. Her heart pounded as the police car's blue lights swept over them. But it didn't stop. The car turned a corner and disappeared into the night, leaving Layla frozen in place. Salim's voice, weak and rasping, tried to say something, but it only came out as a painful groan. Layla spoke softly, trying to calm him, though she was just as terrified. "You don't need to say anything. Just hold on." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay focused. "I'll help anyone who needs it. Life out here doesn't teach kindness, but it sure teaches you how badly we all need it." The hospital's lights were just ahead, a beacon in the dark, but Salim's weight was becoming harder to carry. His legs were failing him. Every step felt like a struggle, and Layla could feel his body growing heavier. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. When they reached the hospital, the doors swung open, revealing chaos inside. Nurses rushed past, patients groaned in pain, and voices rose in panic. Layla barely registered it all as she pulled Salim through the lobby. A large security guard stepped in front of them, his eyes scanning Layla's ragged appearance. "This is no place for beggars," he spat, his tone cold. He didn't even look at Salim, who was on the verge of collapsing. Salim's body jerked with a violent shiver, and Layla shouted, "He's dying." He was poisoned. The receptionist, her face tired from a long shift, glanced at them but barely looked up from her computer. "Take a number," she said flatly. "All doctors are busy." Layla's stomach churned with disbelief. She could see Salim slipping further away, his body pale and trembling. She screamed, "Someone help." That's when an older nurse appeared, her eyes widening as she recognized Salim. "Blessed heavens, that's Salim al-Badawi," she cried out, her voice full of surprise. The medical staff sprang into action, rushing Salim into the emergency room. The noise of the hospital seemed to fade as Layla watched, her heart pounding with fear. No one looked at Layla, the street girl who had brought in a man of power. She stood alone, watching as they worked to save him. The doctor barked orders, his voice urgent and sharp, his heart rates dropping. "Emergency room 3. Layla's heart raced, but she was still being held back by 2 security guards. Their hands gripped her arms tightly as she twisted and fought to break free. "He's dying. Please, you have to believe me," she cried. But no one listened. They all focused on Salim, and Layla's desperate cries were swallowed by the noise and the chaos of the hospital. Salim was wheeled away, his body jerking with every move. The gurney rattled as it rolled down the hallway, leaving Layla standing there, helpless. The doors to the emergency room slammed shut behind them, and the sound of the machines inside screamed in protest. Layla felt the weight of her failure settle on her shoulders. Just as she thought it couldn't get worse, 3 police officers entered the lobby. They walked in, their faces stern and cold. One of them, an older man with gray hair, scanned the room, his eyes finally resting on Layla. His voice was sharp as he asked, "Are you the one who brought in Mr. Al-Badawi?" Layla met his gaze, fear gnawing at her insides. But she tried to stand tall, knowing that the answer to his question could change everything. Layla felt the strong grip of the guard's hand on her arm, pulling her closer. She didn't understand why he was doing this. She didn't do anything wrong. The guard spoke, his voice heavy with an accusation. "You did it, didn't you?" he muttered, dragging her across the hallway. Layla's heart raced as the officer studied her, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her torn clothes and the messy scene she had walked into, trying to figure out what happened. "Explain yourself, girl," he said with a serious voice, as if he had already decided what she had done. "I didn't do it," Layla said quickly, her voice full of desperation. She glanced toward the emergency room doors. "I was trying to save him," she added. "It was Nura Hassan. She put something bad in his food. I saw her at the restaurant. Please, you have to believe me." The officer didn't look convinced. "Nura Hassan?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "She's a good woman. She helps people. Why would she try to poison her husband?" Layla tried to hold back tears, but she couldn't stop the panic rising inside her. She had to get them to believe her. "I'm telling the truth," Layla said, her voice shaking but loud. "I saw her. She put poison in his food." But the officer just scoffed, not believing her at all. He motioned for 2 officers, who roughly pushed her into a hard chair. "Tell me everything from the beginning," the officer said, sitting down across from her. "What were you doing at the restaurant? You don't belong there." Layla swallowed hard and tried to keep calm. "I was hungry," she said, her voice small. "I was just looking for food. They throw food away, so I thought I could get something." She told the officer everything. How she had seen Nura at the restaurant, the small vial she held, and the strange smell of almonds in the air. The younger officer sitting next to them wrote down everything Layla said. One officer didn't look impressed. "So you want us to believe a beggar over a nice lady who helps people," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Layla was about to answer when high heels clicked loudly on the floor. The door opened and Nura Hassan stepped into the room. She looked like she was in shock, but Layla knew better. Nura was playing a game. "Thank you for your help, officers," Nura said, her voice sweet, but Layla could hear the fake concern. "I came as soon as I heard." Nura looked around the room, her eyes meeting Layla's with a glint of something dangerous in them. Layla felt a chill down her spine. "My husband, Salim, was brought here," Nura said, sounding like she was about to cry. "What did this girl do to him?" Nura moved with a calm grace, as if she were in control of the whole room. She looked at Layla with a faint smile, like she had already won. Nura was dressed in a beautiful red dress, with gold designs along the edges. She put her hand on her chest, pretending to be upset. "I had to leave dinner early," she said, shaking her head. "I never thought they would let someone like her near the restaurant." Nura pointed at Layla. "Salim is a good man. He helps everyone. And now someone like her tried to hurt him." "I didn't do anything," Layla shouted. "I saw her. She put poison in his food. You have to believe me." Nura didn't seem surprised at all. She started crying, wiping her eyes with a fancy handkerchief. "See how she lies," Nura said with a soft voice, full of fake sadness. "Street kids like her do bad things all the time. I bet she was trying to rob Salim." Nura looked at the officers, who were starting to nod. Layla could feel the walls closing in. She was telling the truth, but no one would believe her. "Ask the waiters," Layla cried. "They saw her go into the kitchen. They must have seen her." The officer in front of her just stared. "Look at this," he said, showing the others a story on his tablet. "There's been a lot of thefts at restaurants, all with a street girl involved. It's always the same story. Layla's heart sank. I don't steal. I just wanted food, she said softly. Noura smiled a little. Her lips curved into a smug grin. Last week, I lost a bracelet at another restaurant, Noura said, acting like it was no big deal. Who knows who's behind all this? The officer leaned in closer, breathing heavily. If you didn't do anything, why are you making all this noise? He asked. Why not just leave it alone? Layla felt her tears falling as she answered him. It's the truth. When Salim wakes up, he'll tell you it was her. Noura stood up, smoothing the edges of her red dress. I need to see my husband now, she said, her voice calm and cold. The officers moved Layla out of the room, their hands rough as they forced her down the hallway. As they walked, Layla screamed one last time, You'll see when he wakes up. It was her. She did it. But no one listened. The officers dragged her away, the sound of Noura's heels echoing behind them. Outside, the night air was cold. Layla shouted, If Salim dies, it's on all of you. You didn't listen. But the officers just kept walking, ignoring her. Noura's voice was smooth and full of lies, and everyone believed her. Layla felt like the whole world was against her, but she wouldn't stop. She knew the truth. Back inside the hospital, doctors rushed around Salim's bed. His body was shaking, the poison still working inside him. The doctors didn't give up. They worked together, preparing the medicine they needed to save him. They couldn't give up. Every second counted. Salim's lips were pale and barely moved as he struggled to breathe. His eyes fluttered, switching between the world around him and the darkness trying to take him. Stay with us, Mr. al-Badawi, the doctor said softly, like someone who had seen amazing things and still believed in them. As the antidote flowed through Salim's body, the room became quiet. The beeping of the machine slowed down. The tension on Salim's face lessened and his body stopped shaking. A nurse smiled behind her mask. The head doctor sighed, his face showing how much he felt relieved. We're not out of the woods yet, he said, but he could tell Salim was fighting. Hours passed, and the night changed into morning outside the hospital. But inside, Salim lay in the bed, still weak, while Samira H., a woman with a lot of power, planned her next steps. But for now, Salim was alive, and his breath grew a little deeper. He didn't know yet that the poison still lived inside him, hidden in the form of love. In the heart of Dubai, where the tall buildings touched the clouds and the desert whispered old secrets, Layla sat in a cold, dimly lit room. The sounds of the busy streets outside seemed far away, reminding her that she was not part of that world. Her wrists were locked in cold metal handcuffs, heavy on the table. The detective across from her looked hard at her, his face as serious as a rock. Your story doesn't make sense, he said sharply. A street girl with no proof, accusing a woman like Samira H. Hassan of trying to kill her husband. Do you even hear how that sounds? Layla didn't flinch. She looked right at him, her eyes full of strength, even though she wanted to cry. She knew who Samira H. was. A powerful woman wrapped in beautiful clothes, with jewels that sparkled brighter than the city lights. But none of that changed what Layla had seen. I'm not lying, Layla whispered. I saw it with my own eyes. The detective laughed bitterly. And who's going to believe you? Samira H. has lawyers, connections, and power beyond anything you know. And you? You're just a street girl with nothing but your words. Layla's hands tightened into fists. The metal dug into her skin, but she didn't care. She only had the truth, and she would not let go of it. The truth doesn't change, she said, her voice steady, no matter how much she tries to bury it. The detective stared at her, unsure whether to pity her or get angry. You think you can bring down someone like Samira H. Hassan? This is Dubai. Power rules here. This isn't some fairy tale where the poor beat the rich. But Layla didn't look away. She sat up straighter and lifted her handcuffed wrists, showing him how weak she was. If Salim dies, it won't be on me. It will be on everyone who chose to ignore the truth, because it was easier to believe her lies. The detective's face tightened. He motioned for the guards by the door to take her back to her cell. We'll see what Mr. al-Badawi has to say, if he even survives. As the guards led Layla away, the walls of the corridor seemed to get closer and closer, making her feel trapped. The cold cell was waiting for her, its silence broken only by the call to prayer that floated on the wind. But even in the darkness, hope sparked inside her. Salim was alive. If he remembered, if he could speak, then maybe the city built on wealth and secrets would hear her. Days passed slowly, each one feeling the same. Time seemed endless, measured only by the thin light of the morning that slipped through the high, barred window. Then one day, the silence was broken by footsteps. Layla's heart raced. The door opened and the detective stepped in. The morning light made his face look serious, but his voice had a slight change that made Layla's heart skip a beat. Salim al-Badawi woke up, he said. Layla could hardly believe what she heard. He survived? The detective nodded. Yes, but he hasn't spoken yet. He's still weak, and we don't know how much he remembers, but he's alive. We'll see what he can tell us. When the detective left, the door slammed shut, but this time Layla felt something new, a small spark of hope. Salim was alive, and as long as he was, the truth had a chance. The sterile room of the hospital felt cold against Salim's skin, but inside his mind, memories kept flashing. The poison still tasted bitter in his mouth, mixing with the fear he had felt as it took away his strength. But the thing that haunted him most wasn't the pain or fear. It was the memory of a girl. There was a girl, Salim whispered, his voice weak. The doctor, a calm man with a neatly trimmed beard, looked at the nurse with a knowing glance. Mr. al-Badawi, there's no record of any visitor, except your wife, he said gently. No. Salim's voice grew stronger. There was a girl. She tried to help me. She knew what was happening. The doctor gave a small, kind smile, the kind people give when they think a patient is confused. You've been through a lot. Memories can blur. But Salim shook his head. No, there was a girl. The doctor left, and Salim was left with his doubts and unanswered questions. The name Layla floated in his mind like a whisper. He remembered the girl's eyes, full of knowledge and fear. He remembered her shouting to warn him that night in the restaurant. The days passed, and the more Salim tried to remember, the harder it became. Samira's cold smile, the taste of betrayal, and Layla's voice cut through the haze. One day, Salim was strong enough to leave the hospital. He signed the papers, even though his hands shook. He had the storm inside him, the questions that swirled around like a hurricane. There was something about that girl, and he needed to know what it was. The ride to his home felt long and heavy. Dubai, the glittering city made of glass, stone, and sand, pressed down on him. But this time, Salim was determined to find the truth. As he stood by his window, looking at the tall buildings and the glow of the city, memories swirled in his mind, but one image stayed clear, Layla's fierce eyes. She had warned him. Over the next weeks, Salim worked hard. He spoke to old staff members, retired chefs, and waiters. Each conversation gave him more pieces of the puzzle, showing him how Samira had been hiding things, fraudulent papers, secret accounts, and shady deals. One evening, an old man named Hassan came to Salim's house. He wore a traditional robe, and his sharp eyes spoke of many untold stories. They sat in the golden light of Salim's house, drinking tea. I remember that night, Hassan said, his voice steady. I saw her slip something into your food, but who would ever question a woman like Samira Malik? Salim leaned in, feeling hope rising in his chest. Would you testify to that, Hassan? The world needs to know what you saw. Hassan sighed, his eyes full of fear, but he glanced at Layla, whose expression begged for justice. Yes, Hassan said softly. I'll tell the truth. Sure. Here's the rewritten version, expanded to 830 words. He said, nodding at Layla, I will. When the day of the trial arrived, the Dubai courthouse stood tall and strong against the hot desert sun. Its beautiful white stone shone brightly, almost like it was glowing. Inside the courthouse, there was a soft hum of whispers. People in traditional clothes and suits filled the room, all waiting anxiously for the trial to begin. Samira, the woman at the center of the trial, walked into the courtroom with her usual confidence. She wore a stunning dress made of deep green silk, and her eyes were sharp and determined. As she surveyed the crowd, her posture showed she wasn't worried. But underneath her calm face, there was a slight shake, a small hint that she wasn't as sure of herself as she wanted everyone to believe. Adil and Layla, sitting side by side in the courtroom, were quiet, but their presence was strong. They had both been through so much, and now they sat together, waiting for the truth to come out. The judge, an older man with a deep voice that echoed in the room, called the trial to order. One by one, witnesses stood up to give their testimony. Each person's words peeled away another layer of Samira's perfect image. They told stories about her actions, her lies, and the things she had done to try to hurt her husband. Hassan, a key witness, stood confidently. He spoke clearly, recalling the night when he saw Samira do something strange. He remembered the small, almost invisible movement of her hand, and how she smiled a little when Adil didn't notice. Mrs. Hassan, the prosecutor said, his voice sharp as it rang out through the room. How do you explain these accusations? Samira lifted her chin proudly and spoke with a calm voice. Lies. All lies, she said. People want to destroy my name. I would never harm my husband. Her words sounded sweet, almost convincing, but there was a tiny crack in her voice, a sign that she wasn't as confident as she seemed. Then it was Adil's turn. He stood up slowly, and the room went silent. Everyone could feel the weight of what he was about to say. He looked at Samira and said, I remember now, Samira. I remember the taste of cyanide. It was bitter. And I know now what you did. Layla warned me about you, even when no one else would. Samira's face changed for a moment. For just a second, she looked scared. But then she quickly regained her composure, hiding her fear behind a mask of confidence. The courtroom was silent as new evidence was presented. Papers with Samira's signature on them showed money transfers to secret accounts. There were receipts for things that rich people didn't need, things that no one would expect Samira to have. The judge, looking serious, banged his gavel on the desk, calling for silence. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke the words everyone was waiting for. Samira Malik, you are guilty of attempted murder and fraud. Your actions have been uncovered, and you will be sentenced accordingly. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Samira's once perfect image was shattered. Her green silk dress, once a symbol of power, now looked dull and lifeless. As guards led her away, she walked with her head held high, but the crack in her confidence was clear for all to see. Adil let out a deep breath, as if he had just woken from a nightmare. He turned to Layla, his eyes full of gratitude. You saved me, Layla, he said softly. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. Layla smiled, feeling proud but also humble. It was hard for her to accept such praise, but she knew deep inside that she had done the right thing. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. In the weeks that followed, things began to change for Adil. His huge house in Dubai, once cold and lonely, now felt warmer. The grand windows and golden arches, which once made the house look empty and distant, now seemed inviting. The house was no longer a place of silence, but one of warmth and laughter. Layla, who had spent most of her life on the streets, now moved through the rooms of this luxurious home with a sense of belonging. The world that once felt so far out of reach now felt like a place she could be a part of. She was no longer just watching from the outside. She was living inside it. One evening, as the sun began to set, Adil sat by the window, looking out at the city. The skyline stretched out before him, with the Burj Khalifa shining in the distance. The sky was filled with soft shades of amber and purple as night began to fall. Layla walked into the room, and when Adil saw her, he gave her a small, gentle smile. "Layla," he said, his voice full of emotion, "there's something I need to tell you." Layla's heart skipped a beat, and she walked over to him, trying to stay calm. "What is it, Adil?" she asked. He turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. "I never got the chance to thank you properly," he said. "You saved my life, Layla. You risked everything for me. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be standing here today." Layla's face turned red, and she looked down at the floor, feeling shy. "I just did what anyone would do," she whispered. Adil stepped closer to her, his voice firm but gentle. "No," he said, "not everyone would have done what you did. You showed true courage, and the world needs to know that. I want the world to see you for who you really are." Their story quickly spread across Dubai. News of Layla's bravery and Adil's new life together became the talk of the city. People were amazed by the story of the street girl who had saved a powerful businessman and exposed a terrible crime. But with the fame came new challenges. Some people in high society questioned their relationship. "Do you think anyone will ever accept us?" Layla asked one evening. They were sitting outside in the courtyard, the stars shining above them and the scent of jasmine in the air. Adil took her hand and looked at her with steady eyes. "There will always be people who don't understand," he said. "But their opinions don't matter. What matters is the truth. And the truth is, I'm proud to stand by you, Layla." Layla nodded, feeling a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt before. She had finally found her place in the world, a place where she was valued and loved. As time went on, Layla and Adil grew even closer. Together, they worked to make Dubai a better place. They started projects to help children who were hungry and families who needed education. One morning, Layla stood by the window in their home, watching the city wake up. A smile spread across her face. Adil walked over to her and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "This is more than I ever dreamed of," she said softly. Adil kissed her temple. "And it's only the beginning," he said. In that moment, as the city slowly began to wake up around them, they knew they had found their happiness. They had built a new life together, one that no one could take away from them. If this story made you think or gave you a new perspective, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's keep sharing thought-provoking stories and learning from life's lessons together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.